So this episode is all about the mixing pyramid, what it is, and how you can use the mixing pyramid to make your mixes sound pro. I like to use the pyramid analogy because it is so helpful in determining what is actually going to make the biggest difference in my mix. If I only have, say, 2 or 3 hours to mix my song, what am I going to be focused on? And truly, even if you have 10 hours to mix your song, the majority of your work is actually going to be done in the first hour or so, because after that point you start to lose objectivity and you're less able to actually mix professionally with fresh ears, because it's very difficult to gain that objectivity back once you're in it, over an hour or so. What do we do to maximize that very first hour? So we spend time on the things that actually matter inside of the mix. That's why the music pyramid is so helpful. So let's dive in. The very first layer of the music pyramid, right? So this basically sets up our foundation of the mix. And if that foundation is set, then all of a sudden we can start building up our pyramid in, blocks that actually make sense and actually can get basically as high as possible, representing how good your mix truly is. So what we want to do is make the foundation as good as possible so we can build this thing as tall as possible and have the best possible mix. The very first layer that we have is the volume balance. If the volume balance is off, then nothing will work beyond that. So I have 2 examples I want to share really quick about the volume balance and how it is so critical to get this right before we move on to any other step inside of our mixing process. And that is, the first one is Nathan Aswine. So Nathan Aswine is one of my good friends. He and I have a podcast together called Prolific Super Producer Podcast, and you can go find that on YouTube and Spotify and wherever podcasts are found. So Prolific Super Producer, if you want to go check that out. Nathan Aswine is a super talented songwriter, pop artist. He was able to create a song that was licensed by Grey's Anatomy. They played the entire song on the show, and he didn't use a single plugin except for on his vocals. He had a standard mixing vocal chain on his vocal, and that was it. He didn't use any other plugins inside of the entire mix. That means that 99% of his mix was just volume balance. He got the volume balance right, and then that was enough for the entire mix. Okay, so that's how critical this volume balance is. Another example that I have is that once I figured out how to do a really good volume balance inside of my mixes, I went in to show my wife my mix, and she listens to it, and within like 30 seconds, she turns to me and says, "Babe, that actually sounds like a real song." Okay, so anything that I had produced before that did not nail the volume balance, the foundation of our mix, it didn't sound like a real song to her. So essentially, if you don't have that in place, there's zero chance that you're going to get a pro mix, because the volume balance is everything. The more and more I mix, the more mixing engineers, mastering engineers, producers that I talk to, the more and more that is apparent to me. I always call it the 90% mix, and I'm starting to believe that might actually be underselling how important the volume balance is. Regardless, that is the foundation of our mix. Okay, so once we have the volume balance in place, what is next? What are we going to do to make our mix sound pro? The next stage is the sonic balance. So the sonic balance is basically EQ, using EQ to shape our items to fit better together, to create space inside of the mix where it's needed, and ultimately making each of our individual elements actually sound good on their own, as well as in the context of the mix. So that is the second layer, is sonic balance, aka EQ. The next layer is the dynamic balance, or dynamics inside of our mix. So this is all of our compression and also gain staging. So gain staging is super important. Workflow-wise, I do gain staging before I do the volume balance, but in terms of importance, it is less important than the sonic balance and the volume balance. But compression is actually kind of that very last part of the main part of the mix, because once we are able to have a mix that is sonically balanced and it's not just like all in gain staged, all we're doing is just like the final tiny tweaks inside of our dynamics. There's really no additional magic that compression is going to add. A lot of mixes, especially so like pop mixes, EDM mixes, anything that's using a lot of synthetic instruments, a lot of times I don't even use compression, hardly at all. Maybe on the vocal, but if there's no vocals like an EDM mix, then I may not even have to use any compression at all because everything's already so dynamically consistent. All my dynamics can be taken care of in the master. There's very little that's truly necessary from a mix standpoint. And so that is why the dynamic portion really is not nearly as important as most people make it out to be. Granted, it is definitely nice to be able to use compression to make your vocal more consistent, especially, but even like an acoustic guitar or your drums, right? There's things that can be added through compression. But again, if you make that the sole focus of your mix, you're not going to end up with a pro mix because ultimately the volume balance is far, far more important than anything else that we do. Okay, moving on. The next part is effects. The effects is the very last point. And also most people, especially amateur mixing engineers, intermediate mixing engineers, tend to overdo this like crazy. So make sure that you're being very, very subtle with your effects. The more and more world-class mixing engineers that I talk to and interact with, so much more subtle with effects than you would ever think about. And I've learned this in my own mixing process as well. The more experienced I become, the less I actually use effects. The last mix that I did, the only effects that I used were on the vocal, and that was it. And it was just a minor slapback delay and a little bit of reverb. And that was all the effects that I used on the vocal. So the more experienced I become, the less I'm reliant on effects for my mixing process, which I think is a completely normal process as continue to improve your skills. And so that's why the effects is really the pinnacle of our mixing process, because it's kind of the fun stuff. At least for beginning mixing engineers, that's what they kind of think about. They're like, oh yeah, you add reverb to your vocal, and that's what mixing is. But in essence, really, it's the last 1% of your mix, because I could have a professional mix that has 0 effects on it, and nobody would know the difference. Probably. I mean, 90% of people would be like, oh, sounds great, sounds pro. But you can have a pro sounding mix without effects. Quick review: volume balance, sonic balance, dynamic balance, and then effects is the very top pinnacle of our mixing pyramid. Helps shape your understanding of what truly makes a professional mix. And the next time you sit down to mix, make sure you're spending a disproportionate amount of time on the volume balance and the sonic balance. Those two things are the most critical to get right in your mix. And if you do that, if you spend most of your time focusing on that and then the dynamic and effect processing, you're going to end up with a much more professional sounding mix than you otherwise would have just focusing on dynamics and effects first, flip-flopping all of this whole pyramid. If you're interested in my complete mixing workflow, I recorded that in the Ultimate Mixing Checklist, the checklist that I still use to this day to mix my songs to sound professional. So go ahead and check out that guide down below, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.